Adolescent Centre Commission of Inquiry. Can I say welcome to our monthly Toolbox Talks webinar. I'm Linda Lamarch, I'm the Director of Member Services here at the QNMU. Our short webinars are intended to provide you with some interesting and useful content that contributes to your CPD hours. If you stay online for the full hour, we will credit you 1 CPD hour. Today, our expert seekers are here, Sally Robb and Judy Simpson. Sally Robb is a Queensland barrister with a broad practice in civil, criminal, inquisitorial and coercive jurisdictions. Sally has extensive experience in representing QNMU members when they require assistance in coronial inquests or other inquiries. Prior to coming to the bar, Sally worked for a top-tier commercial law firm, a native title representative body and an associate to a Supreme Court judge. She certainly has had an extremely broad and impressive experience in the law. Judy Simpson is a director at Robb and Kane Solicitors. Judy trained and practiced as a RN before becoming a solicitor, and as a consequence she well understands the realities facing nurses and midwives working in Queensland. The QNMU engaged Judy and Sally to support our members who were required to give evidence to the Barrett Adolescent Centre Commission of Inquiry. The final report of the inquiry was handed down in July last year. Sally and Judy will provide an overview of the inquiry and the insights gained into decision making and accountability within the HHS devolved model of framework here in Queensland. This is an opportunity to ask questions about public sector investigation processes and what lessons we can learn from the tragedy of the closing of the Barrett Centre after Sally and Judy have spoken. Now, to ask a question, if you're new to webinars, we are here, to ask a question, simply type your question for Judy and Sally in the question tab on the right-hand side. And if you have an issue, can you also type your issue in the question tab on the right-hand side. Now it's over to you, Sally and Judy. I'll be back after you've completed your presentation and we'll field the questions to you.
Thank you. Well, we've prepared a few PowerPoint slides to go to provide some structure to our overview, and so this is obviously our introductory slide. If we move through, we thought it might be worth it at the outset identifying that a commission of inquiry is a different form of inquisitorial process to an inquest, which is something that we perhaps more frequently represent union members in. Inquests come around a lot more often, and although the Barrett inquiry, most people are familiar with the fact that there were a number of deaths of persons who had previously been clients of the Barrett Centre, the Commission of Inquiry was not concerned with any relationship between the closure of the Barrett Centre and those deaths. It was more concerned perhaps with systemic issues. So we might talk a little bit more about that distinction to start with, but we thought we'd introduce commissions of inquiry broadly. The state government, Queensland commissions of inquiry are essentially very broad, allow very broad powers to a commissioner or commissioners, and the short point really is that you, if you are required to give evidence to a commission of inquiry, there is not much you can do short of citing a lack of relevance to the terms of reference. The point being that you are obliged to give information to a commission of inquiry, to a commissioner where requested, and similarly if you are required to attend to provide evidence in person, there is a strong compulsion there for you to do that. So those specific rights that we perhaps more frequently see used in what we might term more ordinary courts, such as the right to silence and privilege against self-incrimination, are not rights that you can necessarily rely on in commissions of inquiry. We've got a point there on the third point on this particular slide talks about a reasonable excuse. However, that is a particularly high bar. So perhaps our first point is to say that commissions are very powerful bodies, and they will obtain the information they are after one way or another, and I suppose our role is to facilitate that whilst doing the best that we can to protect the rights and interests of those people summoned. That's broadly talking about commissions of inquiry, which we've seen a lot of. There's certainly been an appetite for in Queensland in recent years. As we've got on this slide, hearings are usually public and are streamed online. There's the concept of open justice is very important to commissions of inquiry, and on occasion, if it's in the public interest to close commissions, that will be done. And in this matter, there were certainly some concerns about the reporting around perhaps self-harming and or suicide, and a need to be very sensitive about the public publication of that. So we'll get into that in a little bit more detail talking about the Barrett, but broadly speaking, they are open forums that are accessible online, much like today. From a legal perspective, this slide just talks about, despite the fact that commissions have very broad powers, there are some things that can be done to ensure that people aren't unduly exposed, and that includes paying very close attention to the terms of reference. Commissions are established by reference to what's known as terms of reference, and they limit the bounds of what is relevant information, and we can certainly make submissions where we think that requests might fall outside the bounds of that relevance. Ultimately, it just gives you a little bit more flexibility and leeway if you're represented to perhaps interact with other witnesses included. I've jumped ahead there inadvertently. So that brings us up to the current Commission of Inquiry, which we're going to talk about today, which was the inquiry, the Barrett Adolescent Centre Commission of Inquiry. The Commission was broadly concerned, as I said earlier, not with any harm that may have come to any of the ultimate harm that might have come to anyone who was a resident at the inquiry. It was very much concerned and interested in the nature of the closure, how that came about, how information relating to the closure was communicated to not only the families and the residents at the Barrett, but from our perspective, to the staff. And there were certainly some issues with that. On this slide tells you a little bit about who from the union we assisted. All up 13 members.
Yeah, we looked after 13 members, and 11 of those were nurses who actually provided direct care to the young people at the Barrett Centre, and then there were another 2 who worked at the Logan Adolescent Inpatient Unit, and they actually received 1 patient from the Barrett Centre. And so it was very good for us because we were in that position where we were able to get that information from the nurses who actually worked on the ground, and then following that through to that handover of a patient to another facility to give us a pretty good picture of what was happening.
I just wondered, by way of background, it's worth just saying something about the Barrett Adolescent Centre itself. We've just assumed some collective knowledge there. The Barrett Adolescent Centre was a facility unique to Queensland, and something we discovered during the inquiry is that I think there's a couple of facilities in New South Wales that are similar, but they are themselves quite unique models. It was a facility that often, I think, had around 12 adolescents residing there. They were often adolescents that had a dual diagnosis, perhaps say personality disorder and a mental health, a more explicit mental health diagnosis, say, or perhaps some sort of intellectual disability combined with a mental health diagnosis. They were not considered acute care patients, but they were certainly a cohort who had quite profound, perhaps self-harming behaviour might be the way of paraphrasing their presentation. And one of the things we discovered in the course of the inquiry was that the skill set required to look after these people was extremely specific and specialised, and in fact is probably something we've lost in the interim.
That's right.
It's been a de-skilling generally because it's such a specific service.
Yeah.
And another relevant thing that came out as being relevant to the closure is that the Barrett Adolescent Centre was physically located in the same grounds as a high secure adult mental health facility, which, although there had been no real difficulties there, was perceived to be a controversial issue. So that's, is there anything else about the centre itself that's...
I think that's a good summary.
Certainly a centre as well that had often had quite significant waiting lists, I think. Yeah. So for those 12 beds, there might at any time have been at least that number of people waiting.
And the residents who were there were often sort of the most extreme examples of adolescents who presented with those dual diagnoses as well. And so they're difficult to manage as a matter of course, but these particular young people were possibly the most difficult, in the whole of the state.
Just perhaps reflected by the fact that they needed a more wraparound, which is the care provided by that particular centre. It also had a school associated with it, and that was sort of a very sensitive part of the model of care, was that for these children or adolescents who are often very troubled, they were escorted to school by the nursing staff, and who would often stay there for the duration and accompany them back to the centre if it was too tough for the kids to stay there. So it's a very hands-on model of care, and perhaps one point of difference that came out in the hearing that would be different is, for instance, I think quite frequently the children and nurses would have each other's mobile phone numbers as a way to communicate with one another when they're in public. So they would try to have as normal a life as possible, but...
and of course those things, had warning bells sounding for us in terms of, whether there were issues of, professional boundary violations, etc. But the particular situation was so different to what we'd normally see, that it wasn't inappropriate in certain cases to have that level of contact, and it was certainly only used for that purpose.
That's as the evidence came out. Yeah. And perhaps one of the reasons why it ended up being an inquiry is because, and I used this term earlier, that the wraparound model, the planning was meant to see it segueing into a situation where these the people who had been previously residents were to be looked after by, on the whole, some community care, and quite often, or more often, perhaps community care closer to their home, which was one of the perceived issues, is that it's a statewide service, but it's located in Brisbane, so if you're someone from North Queensland who needed that service, you really had little choice other than to relocate. And there were some shortcomings, say, in the transition planning, and then in the ultimate transition into care, which also perhaps raised some other issues which were addressed in the rather hefty report about, more broadly, transition between care provided to adolescents and care provided to adults, and that would seem to perhaps be an ongoing issue in mental health care in Queensland. So there's some broad background to the inquiry itself. The there's a little bit of detail in these slides about how information is requested, and that may or may not be of interest to people. More often than not, the first request is for information in a statement, and that's something that is more Judy's role than mine.
Yeah. So through the union, nurses would contact the union and let them know that either they had been involved, and there was some level of that they were really required if they felt that they had information to provide that information to the Commission. So there was that requirement, and they contacted the union, and through the processes there, notices were issued by the Commission of Inquiry, and we simply went about the hard job of preparing all the statements. And you know, again, the statements that were prepared by us on behalf of these nurses was really great information for the Commission, because we were really seen not attached to anything in terms of we're not Westmoreton, we're simply putting forward the position of those nurses, and it certainly was really appreciated by the Commission as, you know, that sort of evidence where they felt free to be able to say the things they thought were great, the things they thought were terrible, you know, where the problems that they thought were. Because at that point, we really didn't have any material to work off. You just had some questions to answer. So, you know, that was the job we did. There were further requests for further information as the Commission staff dug deeper into it. And ultimately, 3 of our nurses were required to give evidence, and one of them in the end was ultimately excused because she was actually she'd become quite unwell over a period of time because of what had happened at the Barrett, and they, you know, could see that it wasn't necessary in the end to actually put her through that pressure. So,
yeah. I think, as Judy said, the nurses in this situation were able to provide were really an important part of the discovery, I think,
yes.
for the Commission. So in actually discovering what the issues were, there certainly wasn't a party line coming out of the nurses. There were some of the nurses, in fact, were, and I'm using the term nurses collectively, obviously, but some things that had really caused great anxiety for some individuals were of no concern to others. So some people were incredibly concerned about what might happen to the adolescents they've been looking after, and most people have some degree of concern about their own jobs because, as we mentioned earlier, it's a very specific skill set, and with no obvious new venue in which to exercise that skill set as an employed nurse, which is no doubt still panning out as an issue now.
And it was really a very stressful time because it was a closure of the facility itself, which called an end to their jobs. But the very common thread was that the nurses really were so concerned about the young people that they were caring for, and really didn't know where they would end up, and really weren't part of that process of you know, being provided with that information and bringing them along. So when we were taking those statements, it became quite clear that there was a decision to keep them out of that process. On the side, you know, the positive side of that, it was a view that if the nurses who were looking after the young people were not part of that decision-making process, then that young person wouldn't look at them as, why are you doing this to me?
Yeah, they might be freer to be perceived as an ally rather than part of the problem.
Yes, whereas
but it did create
it created a problem because the young people didn't know what was happening, and neither did the nurses looking after them. So it didn't alleviate the worry for the young people or for the staff.
And an acute example of that might be that there were a couple of occasions where people turned up to work none the
Yes.
wiser that in fact the centre had closed.
Yes.
So key in lock, key doesn't fit in lock because
Yes.
the lock's been changed, and aside from the obvious concern about, well, where's X, who I was expecting to be looking after today, it's a highly unsettling experience as an employee.
So there were all those pressures, and I think the nurses didn't feel there was enough information provided to them, enough support, despite what the Commission might say about support. But it was a very stressful time, and thrown in on that was the director of the facility had been subject to was stood down.
Yes.
But they weren't informed about what actually happened to him.
In the lead up to the closure.
Yes.
So the next slide just talks about, we mentioned earlier that a Commission's terms of reference are ultimately the boundaries of the Commission. There are a number of terms of reference, but only really very few were strictly relevant to the nurses' evidence, and they're up on the screen. So broadly speaking, it was the planning, management and implementation of transition arrangements and the adequacy of those arrangements, and there's a bundle of things that they've thrown into that definition of transition arrangements, but the adequacy of the care, support and services that were provided to transition clients and their families, and as well the adequacy of support to the Barrett staff in relation to the closure and transition arrangements, which obviously applied strictly to the nurses, and the nurses I think were very helpful in that regard. Judy mentioned earlier that some of the communication problems, there were some quite broad, I think, criticisms in the final report about the way Westmoreton had communicated decision-making around the closure, and one of the things that probably came out in the course of the inquiry is that decisions were made in a somewhat ad hoc way.
Yeah, they had, I mean, the Commission report breaks it down into 4 areas, and one of them is communication with staff, and then looked at what information had actually been given to the staff over it was a brief period of time, really.
It was,
because more or less from July 2013, and it closed in January 2014. And in all of the information that was going out, there were fact sheets, there were communiques, there were briefings with staff, but they didn't really tell them very much, really.
No.
At the end of the day, they weren't told how people were being transitioned, where they were up to. They weren't told when the facility would actually close. It was a bit of a changing time frame. Briefings with staff, again, didn't really give them any kind of comfort whatsoever. And in relation to that, the Commission did find that it was inadequate. The communication with staff was in fact inadequate. There were other areas of where they'd appointed people to assist staff with the closure, leadership and support. I mean, there was the Director of Nursing, what's his name? Brennan, who had some contact with the nurses, and at the end of the day they felt that it was sufficient. And then there was that big area of their future employment opportunities and things like that, and really it just seemed to start at a very late stage. It closes in January 2014, and really things are only kind of being actioned by October 2013. Through Christmas, through that period, they're being under investigation. They're being called in as witnesses to the investigation to do with the director. The people are slowly leaving. They're approaching a time when the facility is supposed to be closing, and they still don't know really where they're going, what the future holds for them.
And there were some some sort of allegations being bandied around at that time, some of which made it into the public domain and some of which didn't, which from a political perspective probably were seen to be supportive of the closure and were perhaps harnessed as being indicative of systemic issues. And we're talking necessarily vague terms here, I realise, but those allegations were very stressful, I think, for the nursing staff. And as Judy mentioned, the director of the facility at the time, who had been running that centre for a long time as a psychiatrist. At the end of the day, it was not even a full-time position, but he was a man who certainly had the respect of his colleagues and staff, I think, and his absence at this critical time around transition planning probably did cause some practical issues and certainly put a lot of pressure on the incoming psychiatrist, who herself is very highly respected. Yes. But she had an unenviable task of attempting to organise the route perhaps for these patients without having the established relationship with the staff. Or the patients for that matter. So there's some inevitable communication difficulties there. The next slide really jumps to, beg your pardon, the outcome of the inquiry, which is to say, from our perspective, we were very pleased. None of the nurses received notice of any potential adverse finding against them, and there were no conclusions or recommendations that were adverse to any of the individual or collective nurses' interests in the available report. There are 2 volumes to the report. This is part of Volume 1. Excuse me. Volume 2 contained information that about specific patients that was considered private to those patients and was not in fact publicly disclosed, and I have not seen a copy of Volume 2, but we understand that all the conclusions and recommendations were contained in Volume 1. And we've touched on some of the other comments in the report, so the communication was, I think, on balance substandard with particularly the staff, from perhaps what we're most interested in, but I think there's probably a general consensus that things could have been done better in terms of this wraparound service, and there's certainly some recommendations about benchmarking and establishing what sort of services might be needed. And I'm not really sure where we are in that post-Barrett, post-inquiry process.
Yeah. I'm just wondering whether there's just a little bit of sensitivity, because some of the things that happened in the Barrett inquiry were confidential and they were held in closed court, and we're not to disclose those things that were held in closed court. But we have touched on this health service investigation, which there was this investigation of Dr. Sadler's, into Dr. Sadler, really, when he was stood aside.
It was an investigation into some allegations made by a family, which are not in the public domain. The point that was of interest to us, which we don't need to talk about any of the specifics or the persons involved, really, was that it appeared that the nurses had not been afforded procedural fairness in a way that the terms of reference for that investigation had indicated they should have been, which raises issues about distinct to commissions of inquiry and really more around what are held much more commonly, so the various types of health service investigations, and what can be done in those circumstances, which are also largely coercive and are certainly very formal and are certainly done often with perhaps the threat of disciplinary action, or at least professional consequences from your employer hanging over your head, and what can be done to manage those situations to ensure that nurses receive procedural fairness and natural justice as a result. I put in a point there saying the Barrett as an outpost, and as an issue that arose, it became apparent that the Barrett Adolescent Centre, as we said earlier, is a very specified type of service. Although it is part of hospital and health service, it really did operate as something of an outpost. It was physically and geographically remote from the hospital, the bulk of the hospital services, although it was in the same precinct as an adult service. It was a very different service with by comparison to this adult forensic service. And what became apparent was that these nurses were somewhat vulnerable with the closure because, as we said, their skill set was very specific. A lot of the nurses had been incredibly loyal to the centre, so a number of the nurses had in fact worked there for many, many years. And if you were a nurse and that was your passion, that was really where you would want to work, because that's where you're going to get that work, and you could really make a very material difference to an individual's life in doing that work. But it certainly, I think, at least from a perspective of a relative outsider, had obviously left these people somewhat exposed professionally when there was no longer that employer available to offer those jobs. So a lot of people, there weren't a lot of people involved, but for those people involved, some were able to move into different types of provision of nursing care without too much of an issue, but for others it was, I think, very limiting.
It was. You know, I think 2 of them ended up working with children, and then the rest of them, you know, I think there were a number of them that continued to work in mental health, and 2 of which were with children, and then the rest of them really just had to find work wherever they could. And one of them didn't work ever again.
And I was sort of trying to think of an analogy. You know, how is that analogous in for nursing and midwifery generally as a profession? And I guess you can think of a number of specific circumstances where people might be working in environments that are either geographically isolated or in terms of the skill set required, quite isolated. And some of the ones I could think of were prison environments, or other particular types of mental health facilities. And whilst there might be a very high level of skill around a particular skill set, the narrowing of that skill set might mean that there's a potential loss of currency if anything should happen, by way of a short notice that your facility is going to be closed. What does that do for your opportunities? And I think in this situation, a lot of the nurses were aware that they were somewhat isolated, but there was a very strong sense of camaraderie, and there was also, they had this charismatic leader who they all respected and felt looked after by. He was taken out of the picture, and whilst they still had that camaraderie, it can only take you so far. So that the nurses were very supportive of one another, but ultimately they weren't the decision makers. And there's probably some issues there around assertiveness and perhaps trying to recognise those hotbeds for those vulnerabilities, for want of a better word. So I think that takes us through our slides, but
we can go on to
stage two.
Well, thank you very much, Judy and Sally. That's really informative, and I know that you were, attending the inquiry and representing the QNMU members there over a period of months. And if the inquiry went for how long?
Well, we started working on it at the end of 2015.
15, yes. Yeah, I'm getting
Jude taking statements, and we started receiving very large volumes of material
in December.
To start, I started passing through in December, and I think
the hearing started in February and went to April.
Yeah, so it really was. It was a lot of work over several months.
Short chart.
Yeah.
So, what were the recommendations that came out of the inquiry? I know you said in relation to our members there was no findings, but they did make some broader recommendations in terms of the, as I understand it, the re-establishment of a facility for adolescents.
The position taken by some of the state government witnesses, I think, reflected perhaps there was the term evidence-based research was used a lot, and perhaps the push was for there not to be a dedicated facility such as this one for some of the issues that we've touched on, including, I think a really big one was the geographical specificity of it, so the fact that people had to come to Brisbane, and that was seen to be a real shortcoming for families in the regions. But ultimately, the Commissioner, who is a retired Supreme Court Judge, Margaret Wilson, could see that there was a real need for a bricks, the term was bricks and mortar.
And also, you know, and that was evidence from a range of experts as well, that they could, as much as they were really encouraging, you know, treating young people close to their homes and their communities and everything, there was still there were still some kids who just required some place to go, and they didn't envisage it in the same way as the Barrett Centre, that really long-term stay. That was really not recommended.
Yeah.
But they could see this need for a facility to, you know, take these kids in when they were really, really unwell.
That was one of the criticisms levied at the model, was that ideally a young person might only spend a number of months in a facility like this, whereas quite often some of these kids were there for a couple of years, and without perhaps material improvement.
But there was some, interestingly, I was, you know, reviewing these recommendations and noted that, you know, that they're looking, and the Commissioner had said, you know, probably the people who will deliver the services, these wraparound services, will be, you know, it won't necessarily be a hospital or a, you know, there'll be NGOs and things like that. But one of the recommendations in there, she says, the Commission recommends that service agreements, so that would be between the health services and, or Queensland Health and whoever, be carefully drawn to ensure that they deal explicitly and sufficiently with matters such as minimum standards for staff employed to work in a particular facility. So, you know, that's something for the you know, for the union to look at as well. You know, but as we said earlier, we're not really sure where any of these recommendations are up to and what's been advanced out there.
Conditions are put on them, so it's sort of like this should commence by this date and be completed within 6 months. But I'm not aware of any publicised outcomes at this stage. That doesn't mean there aren't.
No. I think the government accepted the recommendations broadly, but they haven't specified the exact introduction or the implementation of those. In terms of the decision making from the HHS and the corporate office in terms of the closure, I understood the inquiry was very critical of that decision making process, or lack of transparency and accountability in the decision making. Is there anything that we can learn from that? Or any issues that the union should be pursuing in terms of the decision making?
One of the recommendations, I think, was to review the Health Hospital Board and Service model. And one of the criticisms, and I'm paraphrasing and from memory here, I believe, was that the decision really had to be vetted by both the board and by Lawrence Springborg's office.
The board, the health service, and
there was a meeting at which effectively the board, there was a meeting at which effectively the board, I think, was deemed to have decided to close the facility. And one of the criticisms made was that it seemed that those board members had not, in fact, realised that that's what they were doing. And And it seemed
Yeah.
a little inconceivable that that could be the case, that there was so much confusion around the decision-making model
Yeah.
that, in fact, in making such a big decision, there was a
Yeah.
real lack of clarity about when it had
And in
been made and
particular,
why.
where there was that
Excuse me.
saying, oh, you know, the closure can only happen if these other services are in place for these young people. You know, you can't.
So there was an
close
expert
it.
reference group
Yes.
who. So there was an overlapping of expert opinion and decision making, which did in fact really obscure ultimately when those
Yeah.
decisions were made and
And
based
I
on what
guess
information.
we sort of thought about that particular question, and you know, I don't know whether any of the participants are high-level nurses, but in this particular case, I think Sharon Kelly, her background was in nursing, and she was one of the, you know, the drivers with the, you know, to close the, well, that's not quite correct. She was someone who was involved in the you know, the decisions of whether or not to close and
the communication between them.
And I guess if you
people
are in that
ground.
high level, it's very important to always know that that what you're putting forward is well founded in, you know, that it is lawful, that all those checks have actually been undertaken, and that, you know, you do have the authority to be making the decisions or putting forward the plan to close a unit or whatever it may be. So it's, you know, it's not just about the effects of people on the ground, but, you know, we have nurses and midwives that range, you know, from you know, the bedside through to, you know, the highest office, and it's a real lesson to make sure that you're not just delivering a message, really.
And it might be worth mentioning, because we opened on noting that inquests and commissions of inquiry are different, because there were a couple of deaths several months after the closure. We understand that there are coronial investigations pending into those deaths, and we just wanted to acknowledge that that's a separate process.
Yes.
Again, there was no outcome sort of oriented conclusions drawn. It simply wasn't something that the Commission of Inquiry was looking at. But there's potentially going to be further hearings at coronial inquests where the nurses required to give evidence may be quite different personalities, because they you know, might be more focused on the health services that were offering the services to the once were patients. So
it shifts, you know, from the Barrett to who received
yes,
and what did they do. Yes.
So from a practical point of view, if one of our members, if a nurse or a midwife is contacted by an investigator in their workplace about any maybe workplace matter, what would you recommend that they do?
Well, of course, they're to contact the union. Well, it makes sense to contact the union, really, and for the union then to look at, you know, most investigations do have terms of reference, to look at that terms of reference, and then for you know, the nurse or midwife, if they're required to attend an interview, whether that's required, whether they've been provided with sufficient information before they even walk in that room, which didn't happen in this particular case, and that you know, that they do have representation at an interview.
The terms of reference will almost always include to provide natural justice and procedural fairness.
Yes.
And really what that means is that you're entitled to be aware of any allegations that have been levied against you, which might form the basis for the investigation, and you're entitled to be appraised of any information that would help you answer to those allegations. So it's certainly not, it may well be inappropriate to turn up, receive that information in the same period of time as you're asked to answer to it without the benefit of perhaps more often than not it's patient records that might be relevant. But really it can be very helpful, I think, to have the objective counsel of either the union and or the union's lawyers, if the union perceives it to be necessary, to support you in the process.
We always recommend putting in a request for representation, which members can do online, so that we can make that determination whether we refer it out to our external lawyers. Now, that brings us to an end. Now, is there any final comments you want to make, or any?
I think only to reiterate the point Jude made, which was that the nurses were, the union providing independent representation for individual nurses really meant, as we said, there wasn't a party line. They really, it was very helpful to the Commission because there was clearly a number of different perspectives that had fidelity to the individual's experience rather than to a concern about keeping any particular reader happy, and that it was we were very happy with how it proceeded and with the outcome for our clients.
And they were excellent clients to look after. They really
and I understand that, as you said, the Commissioner very much welcomed having the knowledge and the information from the nurses, and that helped.
And it was given
the
openly.
Commission given openly. Honestly, and the Commission was able to understand what the ramifications of that decision were.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Sally, and thank you, Judy.
Thank you. Thank you for signing in.
Okay. Turn it up now.